I was aware coming in that reading with Randall that he's going to read something charming and funny and uplifting and filled with the good things of human spirit. So I decided to read something dark and depressing and filled with despair. And by the time I finish this, you're going to wish that you had stayed home and watched the rerun of Swamp People. This story is called Have You Seen the Stolen Girl? Jesse James, while hiding from the law in Nashville in 1875, lived for a time at the address where Mrs. Virgil Wilson's house now stood. For years, Mrs. Wilson delighted in telling trick-or-treaters about the outlaw, but then one Halloween she noticed that the trick-or-treaters did not seem to know or care who Jesse James was. They also wore costumes that she didn't recognize and that had to be explained to her: mass murderers, dead stock car racers, characters from movies she'd never heard of, teenage singers who seemingly remarkable only for their sluttiness. And she realized that she had somehow become the crazy old lady whose tedious stories you had to endure in order to get the disappointing candy that such crazy old ladies invariably offered. For how many years, she asked herself, had she been boring children with her tales of Jesse James? And for how many years had they been laughing at her as they walked away? Every Halloween since then, Mrs. Wilson had sat in her kitchen in the dark, listening to the radio at low volume and pretending she wasn't home. Still, even though several years had gone by since she had last opened her door on October 31st, Mrs. Wilson found herself wondering whether the stolen girl had ever trick-or-treated at her house. The stolen girl was how local television reporters had come to refer to Angela B., age 13, who had vanished while walking from her house at one end of Mrs. Wilson's block to the school bus stop at the other. No matter how hard she tried, Mrs. Wilson could not picture the smiling young face she saw on television and in store windows and stapled to telephone poles and taped to the back windows of pickup trucks and blown up and plastered on the sides of metro buses on her own front porch. Whenever, during station breaks, the announcer posed the question, "Have you seen the stolen girl?" Mrs. Wilson blinked at the girl's school picture and then shook her head because she honestly couldn't say. She liked to imagine that she had once opened her door and found Angela. She would not have been stolen then, so her name still would have been Angela, standing there waiting patiently, dressed as what? A mouse perhaps, or a rabbit, something soft and non-threatening. She imagined that she had given Angela not just one or two miniature chocolate bars, as was her habit, but the whole bag, because Angela was clearly such a nice girl and listened so attentively while Mrs. Wilson told her about Jesse James. She even asked questions. Mrs. Wilson tried not to imagine anything after the point where Angela said thank you and turned to walk away, because the thought of the stolen girl stepping off her porch and disappearing into the darkness inevitably brought tears to her eyes. Because the house where Mrs. Wilson lived was equidistant from the stolen girl's house and the bus stop that the stolen girl hadn't reached, it seemed to her to have been marked as the place between point A and point B where the unknowable existed and the unthinkable occurred. A black hole, the Bermuda Triangle of East Nashville. 4 days after the stolen girl disappeared, and 3 days after Mrs. Wilson told two uniformed police officers what little she could, a Metro detective, a sober black woman whose air of professional detachment made Mrs. Wilson even sadder for the stolen girl than she already was, had sat on Mrs. Wilson's good sofa and asked her if she was sure she hadn't seen anything suspicious. Outside, a TV reporter was broadcasting a live report, which Mrs. Wilson and the detective both glanced at from time to time on Mrs. Wilson's muted television. Later, other police officers had searched the garage and underneath the house for the stolen girl's body. One of them had wriggled out of the crawl space beneath the porch, clutching a beautiful cut glass doorknob, which he solemnly presented to Mrs. Wilson. The candlelight prayer vigil and neighborhood march organized by the stolen girl's church had stopped in front of her house and sung, Where you lead me, I will follow. Not knowing what else to do, Mrs. Wilson blinked her porch light on and off in what she hoped was a show of solidarity. For days on end, her view of the street was blocked by the satellite TV trucks parked at the curb, their tall masts raised, their great dishes pointed heavenward as if waiting for a word from God. Although months had now passed since the stolen girl vanished, Mrs. Wilson combed through her memories every day, searching for the one small clue that might help break the case and return the stolen girl to her family. What had she seen that day? Surely she must have seen something. The stolen girl jogging past, her books clutched to her chest, chased by a gang of taunting older boys. A van prowling back and forth, its shadowy driver no doubt a religious zealot of some kind, searching for a girl to steal. But Mrs. Wilson remembered nothing of the sort. Increasingly, what she found swimming to the surface of her mind were memories that she had forced herself to set aside years before. She imagined this process to be not unlike that of a police boat trolling the Cumberland in search of one particular corpse and dragging up another instead. When Mrs. Wilson was 15 years old and lived in Jackson, Tennessee, she had loved a boy and become pregnant. Her parents had pulled her out of school, and when she began to show, they sent her away to a home in Kentucky where she lived with two Mennonite spinsters as lumpen and sexless as sacks of horse feed and a dozen other girls in trouble. They were housed in a converted antebellum mansion on top of a hill outside Lexington, but there was nothing in any way grand about the place. Its parquet floors had been covered with gray institutional linoleum, which, although it was spotless, the spinsters forced them to scrub every day. The girls understood that the endless scrubbing was a punishment of sorts, part of the deal that their parents had struck with the operators of the home, something to make the girls think twice the next time they considered climbing to the back seat of a car with a boy. When Mrs. Wilson's baby came, she was not allowed to hold it. She glimpsed the child, a girl, only briefly as they carried it away, still bloody, its mouth a tiny black O of perfect accusation. Mrs. Wilson watched the news in Nashville and tried to recall the morning that the stolen girl had disappeared, but instead she remembered the violently blue eyes above the mask of the nurse who leaned over her as she cried for them to bring back her baby. "Now, sweetheart," the woman said, "you know you can't take care of a baby." A week after the baby was born, Mrs. Wilson returned home. Her family pretended that nothing had changed, but of course, everything had. During her absence, she had become invisible to the boy she loved. She was too embarrassed to go back to school, and her parents didn't force her. Although she was the daughter of a doctor and spent those long, empty days working on her tan at the country club pool, she eventually married a poor boy, Virgil Wilson, who was handsome and kind to her and seemed not to notice that she was damaged goods. When Mrs. Wilson came to know Virgil better, she realized that he had considered her a canny choice, a good deal on his part. Used, certainly, high mileage even, but overall a much better model than he would have been able to afford new. They moved together to Nashville, where he worked as an electrician. They bought the house at the address that Jesse James had once called home, and they lived there more or less amicably for the 48 years it took Virgil Wilson to smoke himself to death. Their only child, a pleasant but wholly unremarkable boy, now lived in Phoenix, where he spoke Spanish like a Mexican and managed a small office for a large company that installed sprinkler systems in the yards of rich people. Mrs. Wilson's daughter-in-law was a vicious anorexic girl from California. Her grandchildren couldn't understand her Tennessee accent on the phone. These were the facts of Mrs. Wilson's life as she now added them up. If she'd only been looking out the front window the morning the stolen girl had last walked by, if she had been able to run from the house and scream for the police and save that girl, how different it all might have seemed. Mrs. Wilson still followed the case avidly on TV, though the reports were less and less frequent. She already knew, of course, that on the morning of the disappearance, the stolen girl had been wearing blue shorts, a white t-shirt, and pink sneakers. One night at 5, however, she learned that the stolen girl had also been wearing underwear decorated with a picture of Tigger from Winnie the Pooh, and one of the only 2 bras she owned. Her other bra remained neatly folded in her top dresser drawer. She had not packed a bag, nor had she removed from her nightstand the cash of $68 that she had earned by babysitting. The next night at 10, Mrs. Wilson watched a beautiful young woman with perfectly unnatural red hair deliver a report that she, Mrs. Wilson, had watched her tape over and over earlier in the day. For several months in the late 1800s, the woman said now, staring seriously out of Mrs. Wilson's television set into Mrs. Wilson's living room, unbeknownst to his neighbors, the outlaw Jesse James lived with his wife and children in the house you see behind me. Now this quiet street bears an even darker secret. What happened to Angela B? At this point, the camera spun slowly toward Mrs. Wilson's house, where Mrs. Wilson was alarmed to see herself peering like a ghost from behind her living room curtains. If the people on this street know what happened to the East Nashville 7th grader, the young woman said, off camera, they're not talking. Mrs. Wilson was aghast. The report was, of course, just filler for a slow news night, but that little bitch had never even asked her if she knew anything. And the actual house that Jesse James lived in had burned down years before Mrs. Wilson was even born. She made a note to herself to call the station the next morning and complain. Mrs. Wilson went to bed angry and woke in the middle of the night to find the door that she had never seen before ajar in the wall opposite her bed. She stuck her feet in her scuffs, put on her housecoat that was lying at the foot of the bed, and crossed the room. She pushed the door open with the palm of her hand and almost giggled as it creaked melodramatically. Below her, she saw an old wooden staircase disappearing into a dugout basement. She didn't find it odd to discover a basement in a house that she had lived in for more than half a century, and for this reason alone, she decided that she had to be dreaming. She stepped tentatively onto the top step, felt it bend slightly under her weight, and groped around for a light switch, which she did not find. The stairs, though, didn't seem entirely dark, so she took another step down, then a third, and a fourth. Soon the staircase opened up entirely on her left. The stairs didn't have a handrail, and, afraid to look down into the space below, she kept to the right-hand side of the steps, brushing the earthen wall gently with her fingertips as she descended. Studying the wall, she made out the spade marks left by the man who had dug out the old basement God knows when. The air grew cooler. It smelled moldy, unbreathed, perhaps unfit for breathing, and it began, as Mrs. Wilson traveled slowly downward, to take on a faintly rotten odor. She heard her grandmother's voice saying, "Copperheads, Julie, you can smell them. They smell like Irish potatoes." And for the first time, Mrs. Wilson understood that this basement was not a good place, that she would discover nothing here that would make her happy. At the bottom of the steps, she found herself in a long, narrow room with a dirt floor. Dim daylight made its way in through a row of 3 filthy transom windows set in the walls just below the exposed floor joist of her house. At the center of the room crouched a massive black furnace, which Mrs. Wilson instantly recognized as the coal furnace from the home in Kentucky where she had spent the final months of her pregnancy. Painted in white letters on the firebox was the word Hyde, Hyde, the name of the company that had manufactured the furnace. And she remembered sitting on the floor next to it with a sad, thin girl from Alabama sharing a single contraband cigarette. And she remembered that the girl from Alabama had pointed at the name on the furnace and said, "That right there is what we're doing." The girl from Alabama lost her baby in the 7th month, Mrs. Wilson recalled, and she never heard from her again. Mrs. Wilson wondered how in the world the furnace from Kentucky had ended up underneath her house and how much she would have to pay to have it cut up and hauled out. She cautiously approached the furnace, turned the handle, and tugged open the heavy door. As she leaned over to look inside, she heard a voice from behind the furnace say, "It don't work no more. It ain't hooked up to nothing." Mrs. Wilson walked around the furnace and saw a man sitting on a box in the corner in the thin light below one of the narrow windows. He had black hair and a full black beard. He seemed to have a dark bruise on his left cheek. His suit was almost rotting off him, but tied carefully around his throat was an old-fashioned string tie. Mrs. Wilson understood, without quite knowing how, that the man had been sitting on that box below that opaque window for untold years. At his feet lay a moldering pile of something vaguely organic that Mrs. Wilson was able to recognize as a saddle only by its 2 rusted stirrups. As she stared at the man, her mouth began to open in recognition. The man nodded. But when she pointed at him and said, "You're..." He raised his hand and cut her off. "Don't say my name," he said. "I won't. You have my doorknob." Mrs. Wilson pointed above her head. "It's still in the house." Jesse James nodded as if this were a satisfactory answer. "What do you know about me?" she asked. He too pointed upward. "Everything," he said. "I can hear you." She looked up at the exposed joist and above the joist at the thin flooring. A stray nail poked through the boards in a spiky nest of splinters. "See?" he said. Mrs. Wilson nodded and stared at the outlaw. "What are you waiting for?" she asked. Jesse James reared back on his box and laughed, a scratchy, ill-used sound that made her flinch. His teeth were yellow and dry-looking, and Mrs. Wilson imagined his mouth was filled with cobwebs. "Why, kingdom come, Mrs. Wilson," he said. "Judgment Day. I'm waiting for him to roll back the stone." Beside the outlaw, Mrs. Wilson noticed for the first time there was a perfectly round hole, the entrance to a tunnel, cut into the wall. She felt not exactly a breeze, but a slight stirring of air emanating from the hole, and she inhaled again the fetid copperhead smell she had noticed as she descended the stairs. It was stronger now. She measured the hole silently with her eyes and decided that it'd be big enough to walk through if she crouched. Jesse James saw where she was looking and shook his head. "I can't let you go in there," he said. "But I need to go. If you go in there, I can't let you come back out." "Who's in there?" she asked. "The stolen girl," he said. "Which one?" she heard herself ask. Jesse James cocked his head and looked at her quizzically as if she should already know the answer to the question. "Why, all of them," he said. Mrs. Wilson awoke to find herself clutching her stomach and howling. She climbed out of bed and stormed through the house doubled over, screaming into a pain that seemed to have no particular locus but flowed from everywhere at once. "No!" she yelled in the kitchen. "No!" she cried in the hallway. In the living room, she collapsed onto her good sofa and wailed, "No! Don't take her! Bring her back!" She drew her knees up to her chest and sobbed until the pain eased to the point where she noticed that the sobs themselves had become painful. She rolled onto her back and stared upward, trying to catch her breath. She was surprised to find that it was morning, that sunlight, indifferent and beautiful, was filling the room as if all were right in the world. Mrs. Wilson climbed to her feet and staggered to the front door. She took the key from the nail, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. She gasped when she saw 2 little girls, no more than 7 or 8 years old, heading along the sidewalk toward the bus stop, their arms linked, their heads close together, giggling and whispering conspiratorially. School had started again. Mrs. Wilson felt a cold shot of adrenaline flutter into her heart. Nobody was watching the girls. Where were their parents? Where were the police? How could everyone have forgotten the stolen girl so soon? Only a few months had passed, after all, since the stolen girl had walked from this street for the last time. 15 or 20 yards behind the girls, a teenage boy, overweight, his black baggy jeans drooping down over the tops of his shoes, some sort of sports jersey hanging almost to his knees, clumped along, looking at the ground, nodding his head to whatever music he was listening to through the headphones he had clamped over his ears. Mrs. Wilson crossed her porch. She stepped down to the top step and pointed an accusing finger at the boy. "I'm watching you," she called out. "I know who you are. I know where you live. I'll recognize you." The boy nodded along, oblivious. But out of the corner of her eye, Mrs. Wilson saw one of the girls look back. The girl whispered something to her friend, who also glanced over her shoulder at Mrs. Wilson. Then the second girl said something to the first, and together they began to run, their book bags bouncing against their backs in a way that looked painful. Mrs. Wilson clutched the collar of her housecoat and ran a hand through her hair. "No," she whispered. "Oh, no." She took a few hesitant steps down the sidewalk, waving at the girls, as if waving could pull them back and make them unafraid. "Come back," she said. "It's not me. I swear, you don't have to be afraid of me." Thank you.
Good afternoon. Happy to be here. Hi. Tony, I always heard it was watermelon. They smell like watermelon.
Not in Western North Carolina.
Oh, it's the East-West thing.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'll when I'm in Western North Carolina. Tony was right. It is strange to be up here in the autumn. And but good. I said this many years before, but it bears repeating that the first time I came up here when I went back, I have reputations and everything, and I said, it's not at all like I expected. They treat Baptists just as good as they do everybody else. So I'm always happy to come up here with y'all. Here is a story that's actually coming out in the winter issue of Plowshares. The eternal glory that is ham hocks. My mother did not tell me about Howard Hughes's visit to Thames Creek on her deathbed. She had first mentioned that curious bit of family history several years before, while we shucked and cleaned ears of sweet corn, fresh from the field, each kernel pearl white and sweet like candy. Who, I had said, absently, thinking I had misheard her, focusing instead on how good it was going to be to boil up these ears and add a bit of salt, a knob of butter. You simply couldn't get corn like this in LA. The radio had been playing, and at the top of the news had been a report about another settlement in the ongoing battle over the will of the late, great, reclusive, multi-gazillionaire. Who's that? I repeated. Howard Hughes, Mama said. Came and asked me to come work for him. I didn't drop the corn exactly, for I believe I had misheard, misunderstood, misapprehended my mother, but I did squeeze it a tad overmuch, regrettably causing an unsightly bruise. What do you mean Howard Hughes wanted you to work for him? She had my attention now. Oh, it was a long time ago. We were living back at the other place in Mama's house. Your daddy was stationed in the Philippines. Your sister was just a little bitty thing. Mama? Yes, baby? What are you talking about? She gave me that look that only a woman who had taught elementary school for decades can muster. Howard Hughes wanted me to come work for him. There is a moment when someone you've known all your born days, someone you respect beyond reason with the force of superstition, says something so incredible, it forces you to recalibrate, rejigger, rethink the blueprints of the universe that you haul around in your head. Before I could say anything, she said, oh, but that was a long, long time ago. Long, long time ago. Before you were even born. Why didn't you? When? Mama, you're joking. No, she picked up another ear of corn. Mr. Thompson sure made some pretty corn this year, didn't he? Mama, what? What did Howard Hughes... I paused, not certain if I wanted to know the answer to the question I was about to ask. What did Howard Hughes want you to do for him? She laughed, that laugh I now miss so much, girlish, eyes closed, involving the shoulders, not quite coquettish, but somehow apology and delight at the same time. He wanted me to cook for him. Can you believe that? The richest man in the world. Shoot. My abandonment of high finance for food was not gradual. In fact, it came to me in a dream, very Old Testament prophet-like. Alone in my bed in my Riverside Drive apartment, I smelled a powerful aroma, so powerful from my childhood. Neurologists say that smell hallucinations are a telltale sign of schizophrenia. But I was well past the age of psychotic breaks, at least the average age. That in my dream I arose and walked to the kitchen, and there on the butcher's block, I didn't actually own a butcher's block at the time, but it seemed right that I would in this olfactory dream of mine. A sumptuous spread glistened and steamed. Foods from my North Carolina boyhood, undreamt of on the Upper West Side. Chitlins, pig's feet, head cheese and sweetbreads, chicken feet, gizzards and livers. There were sweet potatoes and tomatoes and collard greens and okra and squash and, yes, sweet corn. Before long, in walked a woman, naked save for some pirate hat with a great plume jutting up and over. Vividly red it was, and full and large, which altogether is undeniably sexy, and which for this narrative would be a digression. Needless to say, when I woke, it was the aromas, the sights, the warm feelings of the food that lingered with me most. I waited for a decent hour before I called my mother. Can you tell me how you cook your chicken livers? Baby, why are you cooking chicken livers at 6:30 in the morning? I thought you just had a bagel and some coffee. I know, Ma, I know. I just had a craving. Now come on, talk me through it. Thus began what my bosses called the slow descent from my future teachers, but what my future teachers called an upward spiral. I can mark the day, practically the hour. Thereafter, I would call home almost daily before shopping and while cooking to pick my mother's brain and get her advice. I would go home more frequently to watch her in action, to see how she washed the greens and what she put in the water with her hog mauls, to learn her seasonings, her timing, her heat. I was learning a new definition of love. Between my dad's love of history and my mom's love of learning in general and her wide reading, excuse me, it's not hard to figure out how I'd chosen to study law. Investment banking was not quite so obvious, but after 5 years I knew the world of bonds and stocks and mergers and acquisitions wasn't in the stars for me. When I told Mama I was quitting Drexel and had been admitted into a top-flight culinary school in Vermont, her sigh of apparent relief made me smile and feel a quantity of relief myself. Eileen Gano Hughes died during childbirth. She was 39 years old. Her only son, Howard, was away at a high-toned California prep school at the time. The separation had been difficult initially between mother and son, for they had a strange, some would say unnaturally close relationship. They shared a mania for cleaning and a barely kept in check hypochondria. The call to inform his son of his mother's death was probably the most difficult thing Howard Robard Hughes Sr. had ever had to do in his life. By all accounts, though, he was not a particularly good man. A man who found it difficult to keep his penis in his pants when it came to other women. A man who preferred to be away from home most of the time. His love for his wife and child were nonetheless genuine. He was good at the love part, and he was even better at business. Originally a wildcat Texas oil man of middling accomplishments, Daddy Hughes one day realized some serious cash money might be in building a better drill bit. What he dreamed up became a dream for the oil business, and his rewards were mighty. At the time of Junior's birth, in 1905, the Hughes Tool Company had made for the father the American dream. His wife was old Texas aristocracy, and he could virtually give his son the whole world. Howard Sr. built a sprawling brick mansion on Yoakum Boulevard in Houston's well-heeled South Side in 1910. After Eileen's funeral, young Howard returned to the Thatcher School in California, but Howard Sr. wanted his son back in Houston with him. The father argued with the school's headmaster, who thought being away from boys his own age, learning would be far better for the boy than to be at home with an overly indulgent father. But after a year, Howard R. Hughes Sr. got his way, and the 17-year-old son returned to his side at the massive house on Yoakum Boulevard, where Howard Jr. would meet a woman, age 30 at the time, hired not long after his mother's death, who would cook and clean for him. Inez Cross, later Inez Cross Pickett, my grandmother. My mother never got to see my restaurant in California. I think she would have appreciated it. I cooked for her during those last years, showing her what the LA papers had dubbed Nouvelle Soul Cuisine. Without my prompting or blessing, but with little objection. Her favorite was my candied yams. She did not approve of my collard greens. And though she found my Frenchified calves livers admirable, my version of her chicken livers she found incomprehensible. I could tell she was trying not to hurt my feelings. She said. Now, how much do you charge for this one? When I told her, she asked, and do you sell a lot of them, do you? Yes, ma'am, a good many. Now, these chitlins are so creamy. Good. In 1966, Crosstown had only one motel, which was the closest lodging in proximity to the wee village of Timms Creek. Completed just the year before, the Crosstown Inn and Motor Lodge was modest by almost any standard. All painted cinder block and a particle board and veneer with an unfortunate nautical theme that had yet to be consigned to the dustbins of interior decorating. Only 14 units, 7 equipped with 2 twin beds and 7 with a double bed each. So it was the diner, busiest in the morning with its fried egg and ham special when the owner, John Bradham, earned his mortgage. The rooms were mostly used by the rare out-of-towner here to see someone in the county jail, or by families en route to the beaches, another 50 miles east. Which is why, when 2 tall men in black suits arrived, driving their shiny new black Lincoln with California license plates, and who snooped around looking in places your average run-of-the-mill hotel overnighter never looks, it more than puzzled the owner, John Bradham. But that puzzlement would be surpassed when, bright and early, one of the pair with blonde hair came to the front desk and informed Mr. Bradham of the desire on the part of a certain unknown employer to purchase the place, lock, stock, and diner. The monetary figure that the blonde-headed man in the black suit with the impressively narrow black tie offered was 4 times what Bradham owed the First Mercantile Savings and Loan. And yet, so dumbfounded, so incredulous, so perplexed was Mr. Bradham that he, after managing to pick up his bottom lip from the floor, simply said, "Well, I'm just going to have to think on that. Can you let me tell you tomorrow?" The young blonde-headed man, himself a poor shopkeeper's son from a small town in northern Utah, who found this verdant, humid East Coast hamlet peculiar, to say the least, beheld the small-town businessman with something resembling awe and even admiration. Who could say no to that kind of money? That is exactly what Noah Dietrich asked over the phone line when the young man made his report. Dietrich said that, along with a set of choice words that offended the young Mormon's pristine sensibilities. Dietrich was the man who ran Howard Hughes's far-flung empire and who some believe was responsible for making him a billionaire. Who does that little hillbilly hick think he is? Yes, Dietrich called John Bradham a hillbilly, which, for the record, demonstrates a deficiency in geographic knowledge on Dietrich's part. Crosstown is in the coastal plain. There are no hills there. Dietrich was a busy man at the moment, even busier than usual. He had just presided over the forced sale of his employer's stake in Trans Worlds Airlines, TWA, which had nonetheless netted the Texan more than $500 million. And now Dietrich's boss had moved to Las Vegas and was buying casino after casino after casino as if they were going the way of the saber-toothed tiger. Even more aggravating was the little fact that his mysterious heir had locked himself up in a suite at the dunes and was seeing only his Mormon bodyguards. Not even his wife was allowed to see him. Dietrich was busy. Dietrich was preoccupied. Dietrich was mystified. Dietrich had his hands full. And now Howard Hughes wanted to go to bumfuck North Carolina. Jesus H. Christ on the tricycle. Every motherfucker has a price. The boss always says that. When Noah Dietrich told the young blonde-headed man in the black suit to go back to John Bradham that very minute, and when he told the upright Mormon how much to offer the thrifty Scotch-Irish businessman, the amount literally made the Latter-day Saint commence to sweat. He was sweating when he presented the offer. He was sweating when Bradham said, "If you want it that bad, just show me the moolah and you can have my wife for that kind of money. Hell, take my daughter too. Hot dog, I reckon. And by the way, who did you say you work for again?" "I'm sorry, sir, but my employer wishes to remain anonymous." This purchase is how Howard Robard Hughes Jr. kept his visit to Thames Creek, North Carolina in the fall of 1963 a secret. For, after having set a very well-paid private investigator on the trail looking for one negress named Inez Pickett, knee cross, she was apparently located, and after he sent an agent to purchase the Pissant Motel to be prepared for his brief visit, the sum, by the way, that he spent to buy the motor lodge was for Hughes, who was at the time pulling down roughly $50 million to $60 million per annum, far less than he would offhandedly give for a second-hand jet. And after a team of workers drove up from Georgia, directly from the Lockheed plants with which he had a long-standing and oh-so-lucrative relationship, And after they modified a few rooms to be acceptable to the boss's strict parameters, all of this happening within a course of a week, just 7 days, then, and only then, could he himself helm a DC-3 with his retinue in tow, who, to a man, and they were all men, all Mormons for the record, really hated it when the employer decided to pilot himself and them. He didn't really inspire a great deal of aviatory confidence during those strange and stranger days. And shaven, pressed, fresh-looking, and ever so charming, show up at the door of my mother. Her mother, Inez Cross Pickett, had died in 1963. After his mother's death, young Howard was never quite comfortable in the Yoakum Boulevard mansion. Not only was he haunted by memories of his mother, but also by a simpler, freer, and less complicated time and of his mechanical explorations, like the time his dad allowed him to purchase a brand new car, take it completely apart, and put it back together again. The courses he was taking at the then Rice Institute were fun enough, but nothing seemed to scratch the itch he had. He didn't even know where to scratch. The house had only a bare-bones staff. Despite Senior's desire to get his son back home, he still traveled extensively, leaving his son alone in the many-roomed house with his many man-sized toys and many-footed staff. Teenage Howard was not the sort to befriend the help. The problem arose when Inez did the cooking. "What the hell is this?" "I'm sorry," Inez had said, coming out of the kitchen into the dining room with the imposing table where sat the frowning scion. "What is this?" "Well, it's fried chicken, Mr. Hughes." She was by all accounts a tall woman, thin yet imposing, sure of herself, with a farm daughter's droll humor. No, that, what is that?" Inez had been left to her own devices when it came to the meals and shopping. When she was first hired, Annette, Aline Hughes' sister, Howard's aunt, set her up and familiarized herself with the place. H.R.H. Sr. was a steak and potatoes man. In fact, he resented overly fancy food, the sort favored by his late wife and her ilk. Despite his desire to be counted among their number, he still thought of himself at root as a wildcatter, a man among men, a Texan, a beef eater. Taking her cue from the father, Inez kept the meals simple, and in the process reverted to her down east North Carolina ways. What is it?" He was pointing toward a mound of lime green on his plate with chunks of reddish flesh afloat among its shapely lumps. "Butter beans. They were on sale and..." "On sale? Butter? Beans? Well, okay, I see." He poked the beans with his fork as if they were somehow alien. He sampled them as if they were rumored to do some magical thing like cure heartbreak. After a few quizzical chews and a swallow, he proclaimed, not bad at all." "Well, thank you, sir." And is this ham? You put ham in the beans and butter too? I don't quite understand." "That's ham hocks, sir. You put ham hocks in the vegetables to season them up. No butter, just ham hocks." "Fascinating," Hugh said, and went back to studying an engine diagram while eating absent-mindedly, as always completely forgetting about my grandmother. How my grandmother, whom I never met, a young African-American woman born in a teeny North Carolina town in 1892, found herself in Houston, Texas in the 1920s, I've yet to discover. There are suggestions that she was following a man who did not become my grandfather. Rumors of following a family to Texas to work for them, rumors of a job offer. Ultimately, I have no clue as to how much experience she had cooking for the well-to-do or how good she was at it. On January 14th, 1924, Howard Hughes Sr. dropped dead. At 19, young Howard was thirsting to be his own man. He had no intention of waiting 2 years for his majority to kick in. Therefore, he had his lawyers quickly buy out all his relatives' inherited interest in Hughes Tool Company to a one, thus making it completely and totally his. And, more important, he convinced a judge to declare him an adult. By June, he had married a Houston aristocrat, just like Mama, to silence any naysayers about his prematurely acquired mantle of manhood. He moved to Hollywood, and later the same year, he hired Noah Dietrich. The house on Yoakum Boulevard was closed up, the staff let go. Junior never said goodbye to Inez Cross. A lawyer handed her her final check. According to my mother, my sister was particularly fascinated with Howard Hughes's shoes. Odd when you figure she would one day become a buyer for Nordstrom's. Hughes was 61 and unaccustomed to dealing with anyone who didn't work for him and largely fear him. 3-year-old black girls simply didn't figure into his cosmology. I'm really sorry to hear about your loss, ma'am. She was a fine lady. 1963, did you say? Yes, sir. She died just after Christmas. Hughes remained silent, and the silence grew long and uneasy. Can I get you something, mister? I'm sorry, what did you say your name was again? Hughes, ma'am. Howard Hughes. I'm a junior. Your mother, she worked for my father and me. I see, Mr. Hughes. Let me get you some iced tea. Veronica, leave that man's shoelaces alone. Come here. I'm so sorry, Mr. Hughes. That done, sweaty glass of ice in his hand, the awkward silence returned. So, Mr. Hughes, is there anything I can do for you? Hughes put down his glass. Mrs. Pickett. Actually, I'm a Phelps now. My husband, he's stationed in the Philippines at the moment. He's a mechanic in the Army. Hughes's eyes lit up at the word mechanic, but a harsh, single-minded, pragmatic look took over his brow. Do you cook, ma'am? Well, of course I do, but now see here. I'll get right to the point, Mrs. Phelps. I'm not a man to dilly-dally around, if you get my meaning. See, your mama, she used to cook for me, see, right after my dear mama passed, and well, I'll tell you, Mrs. Phelps, that was about the most, how can I put it, the most memorable food I've had in all my born days. Unusual, satisfying, like nothing I'd had before, or to be honest, since. Now, I'm not the sort of man who spends a lot of time thinking about food myself. Take after my pa like that, I do. But your mama's cooking well. Howard Hughes stood up as if the need to pace had overcome him, but his head came very close to the ceiling, and he seemed to think better of it and sat back down. But now, perching on the edge of his seat, his large frame casting a shadow upon the room. To be completely honest, I didn't really appreciate it so much while she was there, but after she left, it kind of lingered, if you get my meaning. Never had a biscuit quite like hers, you see. In fact, I can honestly say hers was the first biscuit I'd ever had. You see, recently here I've been hankering, if that's exactly the word. I want hankering for some cuisine, her cuisine, something fierce. It took my mother a while to receive and digest what the industrialist, whom to her at the moment was just some tall white fellow, a little strange, who clearly in his better days had enjoyed charm and good luck, but who now was riding on the steam of his money, and who obviously had more of that commodity than he had any clue what to do with. "Well," Mama said, "I'm sure she would have been proud and happy to know you liked her cooking so much, mister. Proud and happy. Mrs. Phelps, I would like for you to come back with me, back to Nevada, where I've recently taken up residence, and cook for me the food your mama used to cook." My mom laughed. She always laughed when she got nervous. "Cook? Nevada? Me?" This was simply too much. "Don't worry, I'll make it worth your while. Yes, sirree, Bob." Hughes then called out a sum that made my mother stop laughing. "Excuse me, you can't be serious." Hughes doubled the figure with a casual, imperious air, meant to indicate how little money meant to him, but oddly enough, it had exactly the opposite effect. My mother rose to her feet. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm going to have to decline your offer, but I thank you." Hughes, undeterred, pronounced a figure that even now, in the 21st century, seems just ridiculous, an insult even, which is exactly how my mother took it. Her eyes narrowed at him. "Mister, my husband is overseas. I'm a school teacher with a 3-year-old and another one on the way." And she put her hands on her big belly, "On me. Now, I don't know how you folks do things out in Texas and California and Nevada, but here in North Carolina, I put my family and my responsibilities first, above all else, above money. And frankly, I don't know what kind of game you think you're running, but I don't want any part of it. And in fact, I suggest it is time for you to be on your way." Hughes stood and picked up his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "in my experience, everybody has their price. You don't have that much money, mister." At that, Howard Robarb Hughes Jr. laughed, a big, loud, long, mocking guffaw. He was still chortling as he walked out the door, snickering as he got into the back seat of the Lincoln, chuckling as it drove away down the dirt road and vanished into the ether. Apparently, Howard Hughes didn't intend to give up that easily. He sent lawyers several times over the next couple of months with contracts and sometimes with checks, once with a big bag of money. Literally, one wonders, why didn't he just hire another chef? One of the 15,000 or so truly excellent cooks working on any given day all over the planet. But this mania, one among the many he collected and harbored and cultivated like virulent viruses in the petri dish of his soul, wasn't really about food. In the end, it was about time lost, time gone, about remembrance, about a feeling. Money can't buy you love, a famous song says, but that's just one of the several things beyond its grasp. In truth, I empathize about biscuits and my kinswomen. One of my earliest childhood memories, early June, blueberry season, my mother would macerate the plump new berries briefly, only for a few minutes with the slightest touch of sugar. Next, over a fire they'd go, gently heated, a slight simmer, creating the simplest of simple sugars, but somehow beatified, blessed, and blessedly blue. Then sopped up with one of those steam-light biscuits created with cold butter just before the first rooster awoke. The reaction in mouth arrested the tongue and captured the brain. For a boy with no knowledge of sex, this basic sensual experience, firing off every nerve ending with sunshine and delight, taught me everything I would need to know about orgasms long before I ever had need for the word. All Howard Hughes' real estate holdings were owned by the Summa Corporation, which years after his will was settled, was finally sold to the Rouse Company. When I last checked, Rouse still owned the Crosstown Inn and Motor Lodge. and the place hasn't changed much. The eggs are still greasy, the ham tough as shoe leather, the coffee fit for removing toilet clogs. Daddy did well as a plumber, very well indeed, over the years, and Mama got her master's degree. It took many years of driving back and forth to East Carolina twice a week. She became a principal of the local elementary school, and for a few years before she retired, she was a county school supervisor. When I asked her why she turned down Hughes, she said merely, "I didn't like the smug way he asked me. Like he could buy and sell folk on a whim. Besides, if he was going to pay somebody that kind of money, which I simply couldn't begin to believe anyway, for somebody to stir him up some shrimp and grits, I know he had to be stone crazy." And when I asked why she never talked about this rare encounter before, she said, "I didn't want your daddy to know, to be frank about it. Do you have any idea what that man would have done if he knew I'd turned down that kind of money?" Thank you.